My name is Chon Noriega, and I am the director of the UCLA Chicano Studies Research Center. I came to UCLA in summer of 1992 to become a professor at UCLA. And this was just following the Rodney King riots. So it was quite a dramatic way to come into the city. The smoke was still in the air. Yeah, it was an interesting political moment following a kind of really a 12-year period defined by the Reagan era, Reagan presidency and Bush presidency. And I think there was a lot of optimism on the one hand with Bill Clinton as president. And at the same time, there was a sense that there was a lot of unfinished business, that things were changing politically and they weren't really being talked about. And I think the first instance of that, besides, of course, the riots in Los Angeles, was the quincentennial. That here was coming the 500 years since the conquest of the Americas, and we're still really taking a fairly romantic view of how it is that we were all here under the rubric of the United States of America. And a lot of artists really brought attention to that throughout 1992. And what's interesting is that pivoted fairly quickly from an effort to really bring attention to the impact of colonization to in 1993 realizing that this was taking a very specific form in terms of rising anti-immigrant sentiment. And throughout the summer of 1993, you had various artists really getting national attention for drawing attention to issues of anti-immigrant kind of rhetoric, but also continuing racial polarization that really wasn't being addressed. 1993 and 1994 was a moment in which some of the basic elements of our society were shifting from a model that people were familiar with that was largely defined in terms of a white majority to a much more hybrid culture, and to one in which, far in advance of the rest of the nation, we would have what's called a minority-majority culture. Now that's a tautology. It requires really reframing and rethinking. How do we understand the fact that the majority of students in our public schools are not white? And in Los Angeles, 92% of them are not white. But we haven't really rethought how we understand education. We're still teaching to a norm that doesn't exist anymore. And I think that, Prop 187 really called the question in a fairly nasty and detrimental way. And the only upside to it is that it wasn't taking place in a vacuum. There was the other half of the population, and they spoke up. And we're still in the middle of the resolution of that 25 years later. I mean, what you see happening in the early 90s is artists are at once following a tradition of referencing figures like the Virgin of Guadalupe or Emiliano Zapata that are kind of heritage figures in a way. But they're also really tapping into mainstream media culture through figures like Mickey Mouse, which is used by a wide range of artists in terms of Lalo Alcaraz, Enrique Chagoya, and others, saying here's a place we can focus attention through satire. And I think it's that mixture of both a notion of culture of origin and its traditions, and the mainstream culture that is everyone's reference point, and how to, in some sense, put those two things together. The great thing about humor is it does bring people together. The thing about the arts is arts doesn't happen in a vacuum. You have to find a platform, a format, a context to bring people in to experience it. And I think the move towards having broader access to, say, mass media or to print media, you're exponentially increasing that audience, but you're also diversifying it. You're getting out of the group of people that share your point of view, and you're beginning to take part in that larger struggle for which way will people's sentiments go as they think about immigration, as they think about affirmative action, as they think about the fact that we're a multilingual society. You have to realize this is the early days of social media, but it's also a shift from a technology that was very expensive, like video, like printing, to something that was much more accessible and could actually be done on a tabletop in many cases. So in that moment, you know, before social media explodes and takes it in a very different direction, people had access to things that gave them a wider reach than had been possible in earlier decades. We're not talking about major network national television or the mainstream newspapers. They're really starting in the alternative sector, but they're getting access to a much larger audience and kind of trying to develop what they've done in a largely grassroots or on-the-ground way to project out to the much larger readership of something like LA Weekly or of a television series or a radio program. Yeah, Daniel Martinez is a Los Angeles-based artist who's been active since the late 1970s when he was a student at CalArts. He was briefly part of the conceptual art group, the second phase of the conceptual art group, ASCO. But he's primarily known for his own work as an installation artist and as a public artist, and has done some really phenomenal work that is situated in public spaces and calls attention to the inequities and the disparities that are structured into our society. So when he had a chance to be part of the Whitney Biennial in 1993, he wanted to bring that to bear on the museum itself. The museum and that biennial are really seen as a touchstone or are really seen as taking the pulse of American art every 2 years. And they're typically very controversial because any attempt to define what American art means is going to be very specific rather than reflect the full complexity of what's happening in American art. He was one of three Latino artists, 3 or 4 Latino artists that were in the exhibition. His art piece consists of the museum tags, and the museum tags spell out, "I can't imagine ever wanting to be white." And what he did is he took the entire audience and he turned them into a symphony, that their interactions would bring to the surface the issue, which is he was saying that in a satirical mode, which is the baseline is we all need to imagine being white, and some of us are not recognized as such, or will not be recognized as such. What's interesting is the piece that he did was called an overture, Museum Tags, an overture, referring to the opening of a composition, symphonic composition. And the idea was to really think about the way in which we move and interact with each other is like a fairly complicated musical piece. And if we make explicit the racial dynamics of that, we have a better understanding of our society. That caused a firestorm. Every art critic who wrote about it tended to write about it as a literal statement, not as an artistic expression. David Avalos, Lewis Hawk, and Elizabeth Sisko are artists that were associated with the Border Arts Workshop, but who worked as a collaboration on a number of public art pieces. The first one they did that really received international attention was for the 1988 Super Bowl in San Diego. They're based in San Diego, and the San Diego-Tijuana area. And that was a that was a billboard on the side of a bus, and it said, "Welcome to America's finest tourist plantation." And it had the hands of hotel workers in the image. And it was really drawing attention to the fact that the Super Bowl, the economy, the place where Pete Wilson was a mayor, really are supported by largely unrecognized and underpaid undocumented labor. They would then go on to do the art rebate in 1993 that in some ways really brought what was called the culture wars to a head, by really bringing the focus to not politics, not sexuality, and other issues that were kind of part of that, the culture wars, but the place of immigrants in society and their role primarily on economic grounds. That was really being left out of the equation in order to make it something about legality and morality. This was followed almost immediately by David Avalos, Louis Haack, and Elizabeth Sisko doing their art rebate piece in San Diego, where they took NEH money that had been given as part of an exhibition project on the border, and they gave it out in $10 bills to undocumented workers and had them sign receipts. So that everything was on the up and up, as it were. And that also had a firestorm of response. It was a provocation. And the response was, again, literal, which is you're giving money away to the undocumented. And that's the problem we have in this country, that the immigrants are taking our money. What the artist understood is, where was that money going to go? It was going to go straight into the economy. And what they were trying to do is showcase the fact that however they are here, immigrants who are working are contributing much more than they receive in this society, and that's going unrecognized. Now, those two things really brought that up to a national debate. And right after that, Pete Wilson comes out with his Get Tough on Immigrants policy. And that's really the beginning of the campaign that leads to the passing of Proposition 187. So that's the context. The context for that political shift was really a prior recognition by artists saying, look what's happening. We're being demonized. Our contributions to society are not being recognized. The fact that we are a vital part of the economy is also not being recognized. In fact, the political rhetoric is the opposite. And if you look at the language in Prop 187, it is saying basically, we have the right to defend ourselves against immigrants who are harming us economically, which is completely wrong. It's an inaccurate statement that gets codified or is voted to be codified into law. The graphic arts have always been an important part of social and political movements. It's a way of giving people a very intensified message that is both language-based. There's usually a tagline, a phrase, something that helps organize people's understanding of an issue. But there's also an image. There's placing an icon or iconography into play in the political arena. And I think what often gets overlooked is that there's really been no successful social or political movement that didn't have the arts as a foundation for sharpening and circulating its message. And this is not just a question of sending a telegram. So when I say message, I mean helping to focus, but also shift the way people think about an issue. So during Prop 187, those that were really pushing for the proposition were trying to put an image in everyone's head. And the image is immigrants as taking away jobs, taking away money, taking away public services that rightfully belong to citizens. That's an image they put in to the head. And what the artists began doing was, one, confronting that directly, but also beginning to shift towards another image, of workers, of contributors to the economy, of people who are here and who in many ways belong here and have a voice. And so that's kind of a struggle that's taking place. It's not just political, it's very much about communications. It's very much about aesthetics and how you shift the way you look at things. And I think the crossover point is political cartoons. And in Los Angeles, we had this very interesting moment where there was a shift taking place in the editorial cartoons for the LA Times. The LA Times was a largely conservative newspaper, but it had Paul Conrad as its editorial cartoonist. And in 1993, he kind of gets moved out, and he continues to have pieces shown, but he's no longer the editorial cartoonist. And instead, the LA Times hires somebody at a much smaller paper who had just won a Pulitzer Prize. And that's Michael Ramirez, who was a very conservative political cartoonist. And he remains the editorial cartoonist for the LA Times until about 2005. So that shift is happening right around the time of the campaign and the election for Proposition 187. The book Brown Tide Rising by UCLA professor Otto Santana looked at the LA Times in this period and didn't look at the arguments that articles were making per se, but looked at the metaphors that were being used to describe immigrants. And what he discovered is that the LA Times was consistently using metaphors that, for immigrants, that were based on ecological disasters, illnesses, disease, anything but human. It was using these kind of catastrophic and fairly negative phenomena of the natural world and of disease to describe the place of immigrants in our society. And saying, wow, look at this. They're dehumanizing immigrants in the LA Times. And they're doing it very subtly by the way in which they gesture towards immigration as a flood or as a disease that is crippling society. And so they're able to get the point across without providing any evidence and without actually making an explicit argument. They just slip it into the language and they put images in people's heads that are very negative. The LA Times, I don't think, reviewed the book, but concurrently, you have a cohort of graphic artists, and in particular, one who moves into the arena of editorial cartoonist, Lalo Alcaraz. And he had started with Chicano Secret Service, a group that performance group he was part of, kind of a younger version of Culture Clash, but also Pocho Magazine, which was a zine that reached about 20,000 people. And it was kind of like the Mad Magazine of Chicano culture, but the stock and trade was really the editorial cartoon or the political cartoon. I think that humor has been the saving grace of more humanistic politics in the last 25 years. And if you do think about what the most effective pushback leading up to the election was the emergence of a pretty sharp satirical voice coming from the Chicano community. And that was from artists that were working in some of the mainstream museums, the people working at community-based, all across. The refinement of that voice was very critical to really having an effective position in confronting not just the proposition itself, but the attitudes that allowed that kind of thinking, that kind of hatred, to have a sizable majority of the voters. And those are two separate things. A law passes, it's enacted or not, it gets challenged. That has a very different life, but you're still left with almost 60% of the population thinking this is okay. And that you have to continue confronting after the legal issues get sorted out. There are many great things that came out of that struggle of Prop 187. And I think that happens with every generation, that there is a defining issue around which people come to understand themselves and what they can contribute to the world, right? I think we are so deep in that moment right now that it's hard for us to see the contours of it. And in that regard, it's helpful to look back 25 years and see what did the last generation deal with? How did they come out of that? What do we as a society have that benefits from that generation? Because I think that we're really coming hard up against the need to do that again, and things are less clear right now. Spanish language radio is becoming dominant. It's becoming the dominant form of radio in Southern California. And that is giving a platform for discussing these issues, both in political commentary or talk formats, but also through music. And the music's also able to travel through performances. So you have groups like Los Tigres del Norte, for example. They're able to address these issues. They're like a newspaper that shows up at stadiums and connects with people through the music. But the lyrics are delivering the message and strengthening a point of view about who we are. Both performance artists or theater groups or musicians, a lot of what we get, you think of someone like Richard Montoya, you're getting certain ways of articulating things, but you're also getting a presence and an attitude that says, no, this is where I'm from. And I'm going to be very direct about having a completely different vision than you do about who we all are and how we relate to each other. I remember seeing Culture Classic performances around that time, both in California and in Texas. And the power of what they're able to do to just make you realize, yes, we are very much in our own skin. We have an orientation and a way of entering into the world, both socially, culturally, and politically. It was very empowering to see that. And it could be as simple as the way Richard would be at the bottom of the Guadalupana on a stage and then take a puff out of a cigarette. And that sense that you can have a sense of humor, a sense of irreverence, and go forth and fight a good fight. And I think that was really important. And I think that groups like that really gave people something to hold on to, because heaven knows everything else was shifting in very dangerous directions. But this is the surface. This is the life we live, and having that kind of reflected back to you through radio, through TV, through theaters, through art spaces, is an important function of our culture, of media, of our public culture. And as a consequence of the 60s and 70s, there was an infrastructure that was more or less still there that these artists could tap into, but they could also push into the edges of the mainstream. And that was very critical. In English language media, you see a lot of the struggle become both very explicit. It becomes acceptable to just demonize another group, to at once come from a position of we're a nation of immigrants and we hate immigrants that are coming from south of the border. But also shifting that into metaphor, into insinuation, so that it's hard to even figure out where it's coming from, but you've been positioned in ways that really make you vulnerable in society. We have a situation now where, with regard to media as a way in which we understand or learn or hear about each other, is largely unchecked. And that's having we're seeing a very direct and explicit impact on the political structure that's based on checks and balances. We've had this romantic vision of our media culture. 3 networks and a public TV network. Basically three guys that talk to us every night and bring us all together. And in the 1990s, we still had that vision of our media culture. And I don't think at that time, and for a long time after, people didn't really consider what it might mean that that's only half of what people are seeing or hearing in California, and that the other half is in Spanish. And I think that culminating from Proposition 13, which was very much a race-based proposition to remove funding for schools, as it was clear that the students were going to be increasingly non-white, up to Prop 187, the idea was to basically just try to ignore that and hold on to that romantic vision of a white media culture that brought us all together. It's much more difficult and more complicated to think about a culture that may overlap in areas, but is taking place in different languages and has different orientations toward the world. The U.S. media is the only media in the world that thinks of itself and can think of itself as being isolated and measured only on its own terms. If you look at the media anywhere else in the world, and if you listen to the Spanish language media, the rest of the world is in there. In the U.S., it gets a very small portion of the nightly news, is really engaging with the rest of the world that's not somehow an extension of our own actions. And in every other society, even very large ones, it has to be the other way around. There's an entire world out there, and we are part of it. And those are 2 very different worldviews that are taking place in California right now. And we haven't really come to grips with how do we take both of those and understand it as a whole. How do we understand that as the true measure of our society? I think even now still think, well, the media is the English language media, and they have their awards. And it's only recently we've begun to say, well, that we have to factor them into the Nielsen ratings. We have to factor Spanish language into Nielsen. We have to factor it into the recognitions that we have for this industry. We have to be attentive to the regulatory issues in terms of a disparity of pay between English and Spanish, and a disparity of ad rates between English and Spanish, when ostensibly that industry is only based on the number of viewers. What is happening in terms of the arts is you are seeing a kind of return of that impulse in the 60s and 70s to really have art front and center as the new set of political issues and political struggles become clear. Everything is in flux in a very different way than it was 25 years ago. 25 years ago, what became very clear were essentially the battle lines. That one part of the population saw the other part of the population as its enemy, not as its support base, and wanted to get rid of it. It boils down to that. Today, we're in such a different environment on so many levels. We politically have some of the same issues in terms of inequalities, and of immigrants being really at the bottom in terms of access to rights and resources that are due them, as they are due to any human being. But the Latino population itself is so incredibly diverse. And it's the majority population in this region. And I think we're grappling with that. It's not just a shift from one thing to another or one side against another. It's that there is such complexity and diversity to who we are right now that we're still sorting it out. And I think in a way that has resulted in less focus in this current moment. There's great art being made, but it's hard to say in a way that you could 25 years ago that we know what we have to address, and it's this one thing, and let's push back on it. And that resulted in a wide range of art being made, from art that's graphic art or tied to editorial content to fine art. And there were a number of Prop 187 exhibitions that came out following the election, including one in Chicago at Malcolm X College, that showcased what Latino artists were doing. I think today, one of the challenges of a very, very diverse society is you really have issues to address on multiple fronts. And I think that's where we are right now.